The shovel hit frozen ground for the 100th time that morning. Lars Magnusson wiped the sweat from his face despite the October cold and looked at the hole he'd been digging for 3 weeks. 4 feet deep, 16 feet long, 12 feet wide. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. They said a man doesn't dig his own grave before winter. They said building down instead of up was backwards, wasteful, the thinking of someone who didn't understand how things worked in the Montana territory. They said he should build a proper cabin like everyone else. They said a lot of things, but Lars had seen winters in Iceland. He'd seen homes built into hillsides that stayed warm when the wind screamed at 60 miles per hour. He'd seen families survive in underground dwellings while surface structures collapsed under the weight of snow. He knew something his neighbors didn't. Sometimes the best way to stay above the cold is to go below it. This is the story of how one mountain man combined old world knowledge with new world necessity, how he built a structure that would outlast every conventional cabin in the valley, and how his underground turf house would save lives during the winter of 1883, when temperatures dropped so low that mercury froze in thermometers and entire herds of cattle died standing in their tracks. Lars Magnusson was born in 1846 in the northern highlands of Iceland, a place where winter meant something entirely different than it did in most of the world. In Iceland, winter didn't just arrive, it occupied. 6 months of darkness, wind that could knock a man off his feet, and cold that penetrated stone walls as if they were made of cloth. But the Icelanders had learned to survive. For over 1,000 years, they'd been building turf houses, structures made from the earth itself. These weren't primitive hovels. They were sophisticated dwellings that used the thermal mass of the earth and the insulating properties of turf to create warm, stable living spaces in one of the harshest climates on the planet. Lars grew up in such a house. His family's home was built into a south-facing hillside, with walls 3 feet thick, made from stacked turf blocks. The roof was covered in living grass that grew thick in summer and provided insulation in winter. Inside, the temperature stayed remarkably stable, cool in the brief summer, warm in the endless winter. He'd helped his father repair and maintain that house. He'd learned how to cut turf blocks, how to stack them properly, how to create drainage channels to prevent water infiltration. He'd learned that building with earth wasn't primitive. It was practical, efficient, and when done correctly, incredibly effective. In 1869, at 23 years old, Lars left Iceland. The volcanic eruptions and subsequent crop failures had made life unsustainable. Like thousands of other Icelanders, he emigrated, eventually making his way to the Montana Territory in 1880. He filed a homestead claim in a valley 30 miles south of what would become Great Falls. The land was good. A creek ran through it. Timber grew thick on the north slope. The south-facing hillside reminded him of home. When he started talking about his building plans, the other settlers listened with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "You're going to build into the hill?" asked James Morrison, whose claim adjoined Lars's to the east. Morrison was building a standard log cabin, single-wall construction, the same as everyone else. "Yes," Lars said, "into the south slope." "That's a lot of digging." "Yes." "Why not just build up? Use those logs you've been cutting?" Lars looked at the timber he'd been preparing. "The logs will be used for the roof frame and the front wall, but the sides and back will be earth." Morrison shook his head. "Seems like you're making extra work, and living underground, that's for animals, not men." "In my country, the best houses are built this way. They stay warm with less fuel. They last for generations." "This ain't Iceland. We do things different here." Lars nodded. He'd heard variations of this comment several times already. Different land, same cold. The construction began in earnest in August 1880. Lars had spent June and July cutting and preparing timber, gathering stones, and most importantly, locating the right kind of earth. Not all soil was suitable for turf construction. He needed earth with good grass root systems, the kind that would hold together when cut into blocks. He found it on his own property, a meadow area where thick prairie grass had been growing undisturbed for decades, possibly centuries. The root systems were so dense and interwoven that when he cut a test block, it held together perfectly. This was his building material. The first step was selecting the exact building site. Lars walked the south-facing hillside multiple times, studying the slope, the drainage patterns, the way snow would accumulate in winter. He chose a spot about a third of the way up the slope. Not at the bottom where cold air would pool, not at the top where wind exposure would be severe. Mid-slope, where the earth itself would provide maximum insulation, while the southern exposure would capture winter sun. He marked out his foundation. 16 feet long east to west, 12 feet wide north to south. The structure would be oriented with the long axis running east-west and the front wall facing south. This wasn't arbitrary. This was solar orientation, maximizing winter sun exposure while minimizing heat loss to the prevailing north winds. Then he started digging. The excavation was the hardest part. He was removing earth while simultaneously preparing the walls that would support his structure. He dug down 4 feet below the existing grade on the downhill side. This created a level floor, while the uphill side, the north wall, would be backed by undisturbed earth. The digging took 3 weeks of constant work. His neighbors passing by would stop and watch, some offering help, most offering opinions. He accepted the help when it was sincere, ignored the opinions that weren't helpful. "You're going to hit water," one settler predicted. "No," Lars said. "I checked the water table. It's 15 feet down here. That hole's going to fill with snow come winter. The front will be walled and roofed. Snow will slide off. Seems damp. It will be dry. I'm building drainage." And he was. As he excavated, Lars created a drainage channel along the back wall below the floor level. This channel, filled with gravel and angled to drain downhill, would carry away any moisture that tried to seep through the back wall. Water was the enemy of earth construction. If you controlled water, you controlled everything. By early September, the excavation was complete. The hole was precisely level, the walls were straight, and the drainage system was in place. Now came the foundation and floor. Most homesteaders used dirt floors. Lars was building something better. He laid down 6 inches of gravel as a drainage layer. Over this went flat stones, carefully fitted together. Over the stones, he poured sand to fill the gaps. The result was a stone floor that was solid, relatively smooth, and would never turn to mud. It had taken him a week to haul enough stones from the creek bed, but it was worth the effort. The walls came next. This was where Lars's Icelandic knowledge became critical. Cutting turf blocks was an art. Each block needed to be the right size, approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 6 inches thick. The grass side up, the root systems facing out where they would help bind the wall together. He used a special spade, a tool his father had taught him to make. The blade was long and sharp, designed to cut clean through the dense root mat. He'd worked out the rhythm, cut the horizontal lines first, 2 feet apart, then the vertical cuts, 1 foot apart, then slide the blade underneath and lift. If done correctly, the block would come up intact, a solid rectangle of earth bound together by grass roots. It took approximately 250 blocks for each wall. Lars started with the back wall, the one that would be buried against the hillside. This wall was the most critical. It would bear the weight of the earth behind it and had to be absolutely stable. He laid the first course of turf blocks directly on the stone foundation, grass side up. Each block overlapped the one next to it, creating a bond pattern similar to brickwork. The key was to stagger the joints so no vertical line of weakness ran through the wall. The second course went on top of the first, but rotated 90 degrees. This created an interlocking pattern that gave the wall tremendous strength. Each course was slightly set back from the one below, creating a subtle batter, an inward lean that would help the wall support itself and resist the pressure of the earth behind it. As the back wall rose, Lars packed earth between the blocks, filling any gaps. The grass roots from adjacent blocks would grow together over time, essentially stitching the wall into a single solid mass. This was the genius of turf construction. The walls were alive, and they got stronger with age. The side walls, east and west, were built the same way. These walls extended from the back wall at 90-degree angles, gradually rising as they moved toward the front of the structure. By the time they reached the front, they were only 4 feet high instead of 7, creating a gradual descent from the back of the structure to the front. The front wall was different. This was the wall that would face south, the wall with the door and window. This wall Lars built from logs. He'd prepared timbers specifically for this, logs hewn flat on 2 sides and carefully fitted together. The front wall rose 6 feet high, with a door frame on one side and a window frame on the other. But even the front wall incorporated earth. Once the log frame was complete, Lars built a turf wall on the interior side, 3 feet thick, leaving a gap between the log wall and the turf wall. This created a double wall system with trapped air space, providing insulation, while the log wall provided a clean, finished interior surface. By mid-October, the walls were complete. Now came the roof, and this was where Lars's design departed most dramatically from conventional construction. Most cabins had pitched roofs designed to shed water and snow. Lars was building a living roof, a roof made from the same turf blocks as the walls. This roof would be nearly flat, with just enough pitch to drain water, and would be covered with growing grass. The structural support was critical. He'd prepared heavy logs for the roof beams, timbers 10 inches in diameter running from the front wall to the back wall. These beams sat on the side walls every 3 feet, creating a strong framework. Across these beams, he laid smaller poles, close together, creating a solid deck. On top of the poles went a layer of birch bark, the waterproof membrane that would prevent water from dripping through the roof. Birch bark was ideal for this. Its natural oils made it water-resistant, and it was flexible enough to conform to the roof surface while being strong enough to support the weight above it. Then came the turf. Lars laid turf blocks on the roof the same way he'd built the walls. Grass side up, blocks overlapping, courses staggered. He built up 3 layers of turf, creating a roof nearly 2 feet thick. The weight was enormous, several tons, but the massive roof beams were designed for exactly this load. The final touch was a ridge cap of overlapping birch bark along the center line of the roof where the pitch met, preventing water from seeping through at that critical junction. Then more turf blocks pressed into place, binding everything together. By late October, from the outside, Lars's dwelling looked like a grass-covered mound growing out of the hillside. The only indication of human habitation was the log front wall with its door and window, and the smoke hole rising from the center of the roof. That's right, smoke hole, not a chimney. This was another Icelandic technique, a hole in the center of the roof with a wooden cover that could be adjusted to control draft. In bad weather, the cover could be partially closed to prevent rain or snow from entering while still allowing smoke to escape. In good weather, it could be opened wide for maximum ventilation. Inside, the space was dark but surprisingly roomy. The ceiling height at the center was 7 feet, sloping down to 4 feet at the front wall. The walls were smooth earth, packed hard. The floor was level stone, and running along one wall was a raised sleeping platform built from logs, keeping occupants off the cold floor. But the most important feature was the fireplace. Lars had built it in the center of the room, directly below the smoke hole. But this wasn't a conventional fireplace. This was a thermal mass heater, a design he'd learned in Iceland. The firebox was small, just large enough to burn a few pieces of wood at a time. But surrounding the firebox was a massive structure of stone and earth. The smoke from the fire didn't go straight up. It was routed through channels inside this mass, heating the stones before finally exiting through the smoke hole. The result was incredible efficiency. A small fire burning for an hour would heat the massive stone structure, which would then radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours. Lars didn't need to maintain a roaring fire all day. He needed a hot fire for a short time, and the thermal mass did the rest. The structure was complete by November 1st, 1880. Lars moved in immediately, along with his few possessions, tools, traps, rifle, blankets, and the food stores he'd accumulated through the summer and fall. His neighbors were curious. Some stopped by to see the interior. The reactions were mixed. "It's like a cave," said Morrison. "It's like a house," Lars replied. "Don't you feel buried?" "I feel protected." "How's it for light?" Lars gestured to the south-facing window. "The low angle of winter sun will come directly through the window. It will be bright enough during the day." "And at night?" "At night I'll have a fire and a lamp, same as anyone." One visitor, an older trapper named Carlson who'd spent years in the mountains, understood immediately. He walked around the interior, studying the construction, running his hands along the turf walls, examining the thermal mass heater. Finally, he nodded. "You've built smart. This will stay warm." "That's the idea." "And cool in summer, I'd wager." "Yes." Carlson looked at Lars with new respect. "Where'd you learn this?" "Iceland. We've been building this way for 1,000 years." "Well, Iceland or Montana, cold is cold, and this here will keep it out." The first test came in mid-November. A storm rolled through the valley, dropping a foot of snow and sending temperatures down to 10 below zero. Lars lit his fire in the evening, burning split logs for about an hour until the thermal mass was thoroughly heated. Then he let the fire die down to coals and went to sleep. He woke 8 hours later. The stones of the thermal mass were still warm to the touch. The interior temperature was comfortable, probably around 50 degrees. Outside, it was still below zero. The thick turf walls, the earth-backed construction, and the thermal mass had combined to create a stable, warm environment. His neighbors in their conventional cabins had burned wood all night to stay warm, constantly waking to feed the fire. Lars had slept through the night undisturbed. Word spread. That Icelandic fellow with the underground house stayed warm all night on one firing of his stove. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others were curious enough to investigate. December brought more storms. Each one was a test. Each one, the underground house passed easily. Snow piled on the roof, but the turf absorbed it. The living grass roots, even dormant in winter, held the structure together. The pitch of the roof, subtle but sufficient, allowed meltwater to drain off gradually rather than pooling. Inside, the temperature fluctuated much less than in surface structures. When outside temperatures swung from 20 above during the day to 20 below at night, the interior of Lars's house might vary from 55 to 45. The massive thermal inertia of all that earth surrounding the living space buffered against rapid temperature changes. By January 1881, Lars had established his routine. Wake before dawn, light the fire, burn it hot for an hour while preparing breakfast and organizing his day. Let the fire die down, then head out to check trap lines or work on other projects. The thermal mass would keep the house comfortable until evening when he'd repeat the process. His firewood consumption was a fraction of what his neighbors used. Where they might burn 3 or 4 cords of wood a month during the hardest cold, Lars burned less than 1 cord. The difference was efficiency. Conventional fireplaces radiated most of their heat up the chimney and out through poorly insulated walls. Lars's thermal mass captured and stored heat, releasing it slowly over hours. The summer of 1881 revealed another benefit. While surface cabins turned into ovens during the hot months, Lars's underground house stayed cool. The thick earth walls insulated against summer heat just as effectively as they insulated against winter cold. The temperature inside rarely rose above 65 degrees, even when outside temperatures hit 90. He could adjust ventilation by opening both the door and the smoke hole, creating a through draft that pulled air through the house. Cool air from the shaded north side of the hill would flow in, through cracks in the back wall, be drawn across the interior, and exit through the smoke hole. Natural convection created a comfortable cooling system. Other settlers began asking questions. How thick should the walls be? How do you cut turf blocks properly? What about moisture? Won't it be damp? Lars answered patiently, explaining the principles. Thick walls for insulation and thermal mass, at least 3 feet, turf blocks cut from well-rooted prairie grass, moisture controlled through proper drainage and ventilation. A few settlers started incorporating some of his ideas. One built a conventional cabin but added a turf berm around the north side, backing the wall with earth for insulation. Another built a partially underground root cellar using turf construction, finding that food stored there lasted much longer than in a surface cellar, but most continued building conventionally. The familiar was comfortable, the different was suspicious, and Lars's house, no matter how effective, was definitely different. Then came the winter of 1882 to 1883. This was the winter that would change everything. It started early. Snow fell in late September, unusual but not unheard of. Then more snow in October. Then in November, the temperature dropped and stayed dropped. By December, the Montana Territory was locked in a cold so severe that old-timers said they'd never seen anything like it. Temperatures fell to 30 below, then 40 below. In some locations, 50 below, and it stayed that cold for weeks. Livestock died by the thousands. Wild game vanished, either dead or moved to lower elevations. And settlers in their conventional cabins struggled desperately to stay warm. James Morrison's cabin, the one he'd built quickly in 1880, was failing. The single-thickness log walls conducted cold. The gaps in the chinking, sealed with mud that had cracked and fallen out, let wind pour through. The fireplace, built against an exterior wall, radiated half its heat outside. Morrison burned wood constantly, day and night, and still the cabin stayed barely above freezing. His wife and 2 children huddled by the fire in layers of clothing. They were surviving, but it was marginal, and Morrison knew that if the cold lasted much longer, or if he ran out of firewood, they might not make it. On January 15, 1883, Morrison walked to Lars's house. The snow was hip-deep in places, the wind was brutal, and the temperature was 42 below zero. When he knocked on the door, Lars opened it and warm air spilled out. Morrison stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. It was warm, not just tolerable, but genuinely warm. Warm enough that Lars was sitting at a small table without a coat, comfortable. "How?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with exhaustion and desperation. Lars gestured around the space. "The earth protects. The mass holds warmth. The design works with nature instead of fighting it. My family is freezing. We're burning every piece of wood we can find, and it's not enough." Lars nodded slowly. He'd been expecting this. "How much firewood do you have left?" "Maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. Maybe less if it stays this cold." "You're welcome here. There's room." Morrison looked around the single room. "All of us?" "All of you. Until the worst passes, or until you can improve your cabin." That evening, Morrison returned with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, ages 6 and 9. They brought what they could carry, blankets, food, and essential supplies. Lars helped them settle in. The sleeping platform was large enough for the family. Lars would sleep on the floor near the fire. That night, for the first time in weeks, the Morrison family slept warm. The children didn't wake up crying from cold. Sarah didn't spend the night feeding the fire. Morrison didn't lie awake worrying about how much wood was left. The interior temperature of the underground house stayed around 55 degrees overnight, maintained by the thermal mass Lars had charged with an evening fire. Outside, it was 45 below. 3 days later, another family arrived. The Hendersons, who claimed land 2 miles west. Their situation was similar to Morrison's. Inadequate cabin, dwindling firewood, and fear that was approaching panic. Lars took them in. Now 9 people lived in the 16 by 12-foot space. It was crowded. Privacy was non-existent, but everyone was warm, and warm meant alive. Lars adjusted his routine. Larger fires to charge more heat into the thermal mass. Careful management of the smoke hole to balance ventilation with heat retention. Rationing of food stores that had been laid in for 1 person but now fed 9. The settlers tried to contribute. Morrison and Henderson went out on warmer days to cut more firewood, adding to Lars's supply. The women helped with cooking and maintaining the living space. The children, just grateful to be warm, stayed quiet and out of the way. If you're learning about these incredible survival techniques, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering forgotten knowledge that could save your life. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these critical survival stories. The crisis lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of sustained, brutal cold. Temperatures that didn't rise above zero for days at a time. Wind that screamed across the prairie. Snow that buried fences and drifted against buildings. Families in other inadequate shelters struggled. Some made it through by sheer determination and luck. Others didn't. The exact death toll from the winter of 1882 to 1883 was never fully documented, but estimates suggest at least 24 settlers died in Montana Territory alone, victims of cold, starvation, or disease exacerbated by their weakened condition. Lars's underground house sheltered 9 people through the worst of it. There were difficult moments. Tempers flared in the crowded conditions. Food ran lower than was comfortable, but no one got seriously sick. No one suffered frostbite. Everyone survived. In late February, the cold finally broke. Temperatures rose above zero, then above freezing. The worst was over. Morrison and Henderson returned to their own claims, but with new understanding. They'd experienced firsthand what proper construction could achieve. Morrison rebuilt his cabin that summer. Not a complete rebuild, but significant improvements. He added a turf berm around the north and west walls, backing them with earth. He built a small thermal mass heater in the interior instead of using his exterior wall fireplace. He re-chinked every gap with a better mixture. The improvements made a dramatic difference the following winter. Henderson took a different approach. He abandoned his inadequate cabin and built new, incorporating as many of Lars's principles as he could. He didn't go fully underground, but he built into a hillside, backing 3 walls with earth. He used thick turf insulation. He built a thermal mass heater. His new house was comfortable and efficient. The story spread. The Icelandic fellow who built underground and kept 9 people alive through the hard winter. Settlers throughout the region started paying attention. Some visited Lars's house to see it for themselves. Others asked detailed questions about construction techniques. Lars became an informal advisor on cold weather construction. He'd ride to neighboring claims and offer suggestions. Build into hillsides when possible. Use earth for insulation. Create thermal mass inside the living space. Seal every gap. Build for the worst winter, not the average winter. Some of his ideas were adopted widely. Earth berming became common. Thermal mass heaters appeared in several cabins. Better chinking techniques spread. The improvements saved lives in subsequent winters. But full underground turf construction remained rare. It was too different, required too much specialized knowledge, and demanded too much initial labor. Most settlers opted for improved conventional construction rather than adopting the full Icelandic approach. Lars understood. He wasn't trying to convert everyone to his methods. He was simply sharing what he knew and letting people make their own choices. The knowledge was available for those who wanted it. By 1885, Lars had expanded his underground house. He dug a second room connected to the first by a short tunnel. This addition served as storage, workshop space, and a buffer zone that further improved the thermal performance of the main living area. He also added refinements to the original structure. A wooden floor over the stones, making it more comfortable. Interior wall coverings of wooden boards over the turf, creating cleaner surfaces. A proper stone chimney replacing the simple smoke hole, improving draft control. The house evolved from survival shelter to comfortable home. In 1887, Lars married. Anna was a Norwegian immigrant, part of the wave of Scandinavian settlers arriving in Montana. She'd heard about the man who built underground and kept people alive. When they met at a church social in Great Falls, she asked him about it. They talked for hours. She understood his thinking in a way few others did. In Norway, earth-sheltered construction wasn't common, but the principle of working with nature rather than against it was familiar. She'd grown up in a culture that respected the power of winter and built accordingly. Anna moved into the underground house and immediately set about making it a home rather than just a shelter. Curtains for the window, rugs on the floor, organized storage, a garden planted on the roof, the living turf supplemented with vegetables that grew in the nutrient-rich soil. They raised 4 children in that house, 2 boys and 2 girls, born between 1888 and 1895. The children grew up thinking underground living was normal. They knew their home was different from others, but they also knew it was comfortable, efficient, and safe. The house continued evolving. Lars added a small attached structure built with conventional log construction, serving as a summer kitchen. This kept cooking heat out of the main house during hot months while providing additional space. He dug a root cellar deeper into the hillside, accessed through the second room, providing cool storage for food that lasted through summers when surface storage would spoil. The roof garden flourished. The deep soil, protected from extreme temperature swings by the mass below, grew vegetables that other gardens couldn't. Anna planted potatoes, carrots, onions, and herbs. The living roof that provided insulation also provided food. By the turn of the century, Lars's underground house had been standing for 20 years. The structure showed no signs of deterioration. In fact, it had improved with age. The grass roots in the turf walls had grown together, creating an even stronger bond. The interior had dried and stabilized. The thermal mass had been charged and discharged thousands of times, the stones seasoned by years of heat cycling. Other settlers who'd built conventional cabins at the same time were dealing with rot, shifting logs, failed chinking, and deteriorating roofs. Some structures had been rebuilt entirely. Lars's house just got more solid. Visitors continued coming. Some were curious tourists, drawn by stories of the man who lived underground. Others were practical settlers wanting to learn techniques. Lars welcomed them all, explaining his methods patiently. He'd refined his teaching approach over the years. He didn't just show people what he'd built, he explained why. The principles of thermal mass, insulation, solar orientation, moisture control. He helped people understand that successful cold weather construction wasn't about following a single design. It was about understanding principles and applying them to individual situations. You don't need to build exactly like this, he'd tell visitors. You need to understand what makes this work, then apply those ideas to your own situation. Maybe you build partially underground. Maybe you just add earth berming. Maybe you focus on thermal mass, but understand why these things matter. Some of his students went on to build impressive structures. A homesteader in the Judith Basin built a partially underground house that became known throughout the region for its efficiency. A rancher near Havre built a complete Icelandic-style turf house after visiting Lars and studying his techniques. The knowledge spread in ripples, each person adapting and applying the principles in their own way. The lessons weren't limited to residential construction. Ranchers started building earth-sheltered barns for livestock, finding that animals needed less feed in winter when protected from wind and extreme cold. Root cellars improved, lasting longer and preserving food better. Even some commercial buildings incorporated earth berming on north walls for insulation. The hard winter of 1882 to 1883 remained in people's memory as a benchmark. That was the winter that separated adequate construction from good construction. That was the winter that proved Lars's methods weren't just different, they were superior. James Morrison, who'd sheltered in Lars's house during that terrible winter, became one of the strongest advocates for improved construction. He'd talk to new settlers, warning them not to make the mistakes he'd made. Build right the first time, he'd say. Don't wait until you're freezing to realize your cabin isn't good enough. By 1910, Lars was 64 years old. His children were grown, 3 still living in Montana, 1 having moved to Oregon. His underground house had stood for 30 years, still solid, still comfortable, still efficient. The sod roof was covered in wildflowers in summer. The walls were invisible, covered by the hillside. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a grassy mound with a wooden door. That year, a journalist from a Great Falls newspaper came to interview Lars for a story about early Montana settlers. The journalist was fascinated by the house and spent 2 days examining every detail, taking photographs and recording Lars's explanations. "Why do you think more people didn't build this way?" the journalist asked. Lars considered the question. "It's different. People trust what they know, and it requires more initial work. But most importantly, you can't see the benefits until you experience a hard winter, and by then it's too late to rebuild. Do you think your methods will be remembered? Some will remember, some will forget. That's always the way with knowledge. What matters is that a few people learned and passed it on. That's enough." The article appeared in the Great Falls Tribune in August 1910. It included photographs of the house, diagrams of its construction, and detailed explanations of the principles involved. Copies of that article were passed around Montana Territory and beyond, reaching readers who'd never heard of underground turf construction. Some readers dismissed it as a curiosity. Others recognized its value. A few even traveled to Montana to see the house for themselves and learn from Lars directly. The article had given the knowledge a wider audience than Lars could have reached on his own. During World War I, when resources were scarce and efficiency became critical, some of Lars's ideas experienced a revival. The government was promoting conservation. Building techniques that reduced fuel consumption were suddenly practical rather than merely interesting. Several Montana families built earth-sheltered structures during this period, applying principles Lars had demonstrated decades earlier. Lars died in 1928 at the age of 82. He lived in his underground house until the end, finally succumbing to pneumonia during a mild winter after a lifetime of surviving brutal ones. Anna continued living in the house for another 3 years before moving in with one of their daughters. The house itself stood empty for a period in the 1930s. The property changed hands several times, but the structure remained sound. The turf walls held. The roof stayed intact. The thermal mass, uncharged and unused, waited silently. In 1945, a returning World War II veteran named Robert Lindstrom bought the property. He'd heard stories about the underground house from old-timers and was curious. When he explored the structure, he found it remarkably well preserved. 75 years after construction, the basic integrity was still there. Lindstrom restored the house, replacing deteriorated wooden elements, repairing the roof where time had finally taken its toll, and updating some of the interior. But the core structure, the turf walls, the thermal mass, the fundamental design, remained Lars's work. Lindstrom lived in the house for 12 years. He documented its performance, keeping records of interior temperatures, firewood consumption, and comfort levels. His data confirmed what Lars had known intuitively. The underground turf house maintained interior temperatures between 45 and 65 degrees year-round, with minimal heating input. In winter, burning 1 cord of wood per month kept it comfortable. In summer, no cooling was needed at all. Those records, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, provide quantitative proof of what Lars achieved. Compared to conventional construction of the same era, his house was approximately 3 to 4 times more energy efficient. That efficiency came from the combination of earth sheltering, massive walls, thermal mass, and careful orientation. No single element made the difference. It was the integration of all the principles working together. The house was eventually donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1987, recognized as a significant example of immigrant building traditions and cold climate adaptation. It underwent professional restoration, with archaeologists and historians documenting every detail of its construction. Today, the house stands as an educational site. Visitors can tour the interior, See the massive turf walls, experience the stable temperature, and understand how Lars applied ancient Icelandic knowledge to Montana's frontier. Interpretive displays explain the principles of thermal mass, earth sheltering, and passive solar design, connecting Lars's intuitive understanding to modern building science. The legacy of Lars Magnusson's underground turf house extends beyond the structure itself. It represents the broader story of immigrant knowledge shaping American frontier survival. Lars brought techniques from Iceland, adapted them to Montana's specific conditions, and shared them with his adopted community. That transfer of knowledge, that willingness to think differently and build differently, saved lives. Modern sustainable building has rediscovered many of Lars's principles: earth-sheltered housing, passive solar design, thermal mass for temperature stabilization. These are now recognized as legitimate techniques. Organizations like the Passive House Institute promote building methods that would be entirely familiar to Lars. Use the earth for insulation. Store heat in mass. Design for your climate. The terminology is new, but the principles are ancient. Some modern builders have studied Lars's house specifically, using it as a model for contemporary earth-sheltered designs. The principles translate remarkably well. Earth is still an excellent insulator. Thermal mass still stabilizes temperatures. South-facing orientation still captures winter sun. The fundamentals haven't changed. What has changed is our appreciation for what Lars accomplished. In his time, he was seen as unusual, building strangely, doing things the hard way. Now we recognize him as ahead of his time, understanding principles that mainstream construction took another century to rediscover. The criticism he faced, that he was making extra work, that conventional methods were good enough, that different meant wrong, sounds familiar to anyone who's tried to build sustainably or efficiently today. Innovation always faces resistance. The different is always suspicious. But sometimes, as Lars proved, the different is exactly right. His neighbors built cabins that barely lasted 20 years. Lars built a house that's still standing after 140 years. They cut corners to save time. Lars invested time to build properly. They followed tradition. Lars understood principles. The results speak for themselves. If these forgotten survival techniques fascinate you, don't forget to subscribe. We're bringing you stories and methods that could save your life someday. Click that subscribe button right now and join our community of people who value real knowledge over modern convenience. The Montana winter hasn't changed. It's still cold. The wind still blows. The temperature still drops to levels that can kill. What's changed is how we face it. We have better materials now, better tools, better understanding. But we've also lost something. We've lost the direct knowledge that Lars possessed. The understanding that comes from building your own shelter with your own hands using materials from your own land. Lars couldn't go to a store and buy insulation. He had to understand what insulation was and how to create it from available materials. He couldn't hire a contractor. He had to learn the principles and apply them himself. He couldn't rely on fossil fuel heating to compensate for poor design. He had to build right because his life depended on it. That necessity, that direct connection between design and survival, created deep knowledge. Lars didn't just know his house was warm. He knew why it was warm. He understood every element, every decision, every compromise. That understanding let him teach others effectively. He could explain not just what to do, but why to do it. This is the critical lost element in modern construction. We've specialized to the point where very few people understand the whole system. We have specialists for framing, for plumbing, for electrical, for insulation. Each knows their domain well, but few understand how everything integrates. Lars knew everything because he did everything. There's a lesson here that extends beyond building houses. It's about the value of comprehensive knowledge, of understanding entire systems rather than just components. It's about being able to adapt and improvise based on principles rather than just following procedures. It's about self-reliance and the confidence that comes from truly understanding your environment. Lars faced critics who said he was wasting time, wasting effort, building strangely. He proved them wrong simply by surviving and thriving. His house sheltered his family comfortably for decades. It saved lives during crisis. It demonstrated that different doesn't mean wrong, that ancient doesn't mean primitive, that sometimes the old ways aren't just nostalgic, they're superior. The underground turf house stands as a monument to practical wisdom. It's not a museum piece from a dead past. It's a working demonstration of principles that remain valid. Modern visitors often express surprise at how comfortable the interior is, how stable the temperature, how effective the design. They expected something crude and uncomfortable. They find something remarkably sophisticated. This disconnect between expectation and reality reveals our prejudices. We assume modern is better, that anything old or traditional must be inferior. Lars's house challenges that assumption. It works better than many modern buildings at the exact function it was designed for, maintaining comfort with minimal energy input. That's the core lesson. Lars wasn't trying to build the biggest house or the fanciest house or the most impressive house. He was trying to build a house that worked, that kept people warm efficiently and reliably in one of the harshest climates on Earth. He succeeded completely. Everything about the design serves that function. There's no wasted effort, no unnecessary elements, no decoration for decoration's sake. It's pure function, and because the function is achieved so well, it's beautiful in its own way. The children who grew up in that house, who thought underground living was normal, who experienced consistent warmth in the coldest months, carried that experience into their adult lives. They knew what good shelter felt like. They had a benchmark. Some built their own houses using their father's principles. Others at least knew what to look for in good construction. That transmission of knowledge, from Lars to his children, from Lars to his neighbors, from Lars's example to modern builders, represents the real legacy. The house is impressive, but the knowledge is invaluable. The structure will eventually fail, decades or centuries from now. The knowledge, if preserved and passed on, can continue indefinitely. This is why documentation matters. The photographs from 1910, the measurements taken during restoration, the records kept by Lindstrom, the educational displays at the site today, all of these preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Future generations can learn from Lars even though he's been dead for almost a century. Consider what would have been lost if Lars hadn't shared his knowledge, if his house had been built and then forgotten, if no records had been kept. All that accumulated wisdom, all those refined techniques, all those survival lessons, gone. Instead, because Lars taught others and because the house itself survived as a teaching tool, the knowledge persists. There's a parallel here to all traditional knowledge, all folk wisdom, all practical skills developed over generations. This knowledge is fragile. It's not written in textbooks. It's not taught in schools. It's passed person to person, demonstration and practice. When the people who hold this knowledge die without passing it on, it vanishes. Lars understood this. He welcomed visitors. He answered questions. He helped others build. He didn't hoard his knowledge or treat it as proprietary. He shared freely because he understood that knowledge has value only when used. A technique known by one person can die with that person. A technique known by hundreds will survive and spread. The winter of 1882 to 1883, the hard winter that nearly broke the Montana frontier, served as the ultimate validation of Lars's approach. When crisis came, when conditions exceeded what normal construction could handle, the underground turf house proved its worth. 9 people sheltered there survived comfortably while others struggled and some died. That kind of validation is harsh but definitive. Theory is interesting. Survival is proof. Lars could have explained his principles for years without convincing skeptics. One hard winter living in comfort while others froze convinced more people than any argument could. This is often how traditional knowledge proves itself, not through abstract demonstration, but through crisis performance. The techniques that work under extreme conditions are remembered and passed on. The techniques that fail are forgotten. Lars's house worked when it mattered most, ensuring its place in memory. Modern survival and preparedness communities have rediscovered this principle. It's not enough to have gear and supplies. You need knowledge and skills. You need to understand how systems work. You need to be able to improvise and adapt. Lars embodied all of these. He had knowledge from Iceland. He adapted it to Montana. He improvised solutions with available materials. And when crisis came, his knowledge saved lives. The underground turf house isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a lesson in preparedness. Build before crisis comes. Build for the worst case, not the average case. Build with understanding, not just following instructions. These lessons apply far beyond house construction. They apply to any form of preparation for uncertainty. Lars didn't know that the winter of 1882 to 1883 would be historically brutal. He built assuming that brutal winters were possible and preparing for them. When one arrived, he was ready. His neighbors, who'd built for average conditions, weren't ready. The difference was foresight and the willingness to invest effort up front. There's always tension between the quick solution and the thorough solution, between what's adequate for normal conditions and what's needed for extreme conditions. Modern life usually rewards the quick solution. Get it done fast, move on to the next thing. Lars took the opposite approach. Do it right, even if it takes longer, because you only get one chance to build your shelter before winter comes. Both approaches have costs. The quick solution saves time but may fail under stress. The thorough solution requires more initial investment but provides security. Lars made his choice consciously. He'd rather invest extra effort than risk inadequate shelter. Given the outcomes, it was clearly the right choice. This decision framework applies broadly. How much insurance do you buy? How much do you save for emergencies? How thoroughly do you maintain your equipment? All of these involve the same calculation. What's the cost of being overprepared versus the cost of being underprepared? In Lars's case, being overprepared cost him a few extra weeks of digging. Being underprepared cost his neighbors dearly. The house still stands, a physical reminder of these lessons. Visitors can walk inside, feel the thick walls, see the thermal mass, experience the stable temperature, and understand viscerally what Lars created. It's not abstract knowledge in a book, it's a real place that really works, demonstrating real principles. This experiential learning is powerful. You can read about earth sheltering and thermal mass, but standing inside the house makes it real. You can hear about how grass roots bind turf blocks together, but seeing the walls makes it concrete. You can be told that the house stays warm with minimal heating, but feeling the comfortable temperature on a cold day proves it. That's why the house has been preserved. It's not just a historical artifact, it's a three-dimensional textbook teaching principles that remain relevant. Every school group that visits, every builder who studies it, every curious person who walks through the door potentially learns something that might be applied elsewhere. Some visitors have gone home and incorporated ideas into their own projects, maybe not building fully underground, but using earth berming for insulation. Maybe not using turf blocks, but understanding thermal mass. The house plants seeds of knowledge that grow in unexpected places. Lars would probably be amazed that his simple survival shelter has become an educational site. He built it to stay warm, not to teach posterity. But the fact that it does teach posterity is fitting. Lars was a teacher by nature, patient in explaining his methods to anyone who asked. His house continues that teaching long after his death. The story of Lars Magnusson and his underground turf house is ultimately a story about the value of knowledge, the importance of preparation, and the wisdom of learning from diverse sources. Lars brought knowledge from Iceland. He learned from his Montana experience. He shared with his community, he adapted and improved, and he created something that lasted. In our modern age, with our climate-controlled environments and our abundant, cheap energy, it's easy to forget how much skill and knowledge was required to survive a Montana winter in 1880. Lars couldn't just turn up a thermostat. He had to understand heat, understand insulation, understand building, and apply that understanding correctly or face serious consequences. We've traded that deep, practical knowledge for convenience and specialized expertise. In many ways, that's progress, but we've also lost something valuable. We've lost the ability to create our own shelter from local materials, to understand our environment deeply, to be truly self-sufficient. Lars had those abilities, and they served him well. The underground turf house challenges us to think about what knowledge we've lost, what skills we've forgotten, and whether we should work to recover some of them. Not to abandon modernity, but to supplement it with traditional wisdom. To understand that ancient techniques aren't automatically obsolete, that different cultures have solved problems in different ways, and that we can learn from all of them. Lars learned from Iceland and applied that knowledge in Montana. We can learn from Lars and apply it to our own contexts. The specific techniques may not transfer directly. Most of us won't build underground turf houses, but the principles, think ahead, build for extreme conditions, understand why things work, adapt traditional knowledge. These principles transfer perfectly. The house stands in Montana, a grass-covered mound on a hillside, looking much as it did when Lars first completed it. Inside, the temperature stays stable. The walls stand strong. The design still works. After more than a century, Lars Magnusson's solution to surviving brutal winters remains effective, efficient, and relevant. That's the true measure of good design. Not whether it's fashionable or conventional or easy, but whether it works. Lars's underground turf house works. It worked in 1880, it works today, and the principles it embodies will work tomorrow. That's a legacy worth preserving, a lesson worth learning, and a story worth telling. From a simple hole in the ground, a man built shelter that saved lives, proved principles, and taught lessons that echo across generations. That's what one mountain man accomplished with knowledge, effort, and the courage to build differently. His underground turf house survives as proof that sometimes the old ways aren't just good enough, they're better than anything we've invented since.